Can Donald Trump steal this election? Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to the Romano Report. Today is Monday, November 4th, which means that the election is tomorrow, if you can believe it. Now, I've been wanting to make this video for a while because I know that people are justifiably concerned about Donald Trump trying to steal this election. After all, he tried to steal the last election, and we know that if he loses this election, which I believe he will, that he will try to steal it again. So there's definitely reasons to be concerned. But I think the concern is greatly overblown. I personally am not all that worried about it because I know what it would take for him to steal this election, and it's exceedingly unlikely, as I'll explain. So let's begin with the fact. Now this caused a lot of alarm in the last week. Donald Trump appeared to reference some deal he has with Speaker Mike Johnson about the election and how they're confident how it'll turn out. But he's not going to tell us what their deal is until after the election. And so obviously most people assumed that this is some sort of deal to steal the election in the House of Representatives, and that's probably what he was referring to. But I don't really think he's got too much of a chance of being able to do that. And let me explain why. So when we're talking about Trump trying to steal the election, we're not just talking about the House or Congress. We're really talking about two things. We're talking about Trump trying to steal it first in the states and then in Congress. I mean, after all, Congress is where he tried to steal it last time. I mean, he tried to in the states as well in court, but his real effort was in Congress. Now, let me explain it this way. Let's begin with the states. Then we'll move on to the Congress. Where people are most concerned about the states is that they're worried that elections officials, that Trump cultists who have managed to get themselves either elected or appointed to various positions of authority over the election in the various states, that those people will somehow be able to refuse to certify the election if Kamala Harris wins, either at the state level or at county or precinct levels, and thus, depriving her of electoral votes and then throwing the whole thing to the House of Representatives to decide the election. So that's what people are most concerned about. And that's really not much of a concern. And the reason is that these elections officials, from precinct captains, whatever they're called in the various states, all the way up to secretaries of state, they don't have the discretion under law to refuse to certify. So what we're worried about is, Donald Trump losing the election, claiming massive fraud, claiming the election was stolen, and then, of course, his entire cult, including these elections officials in the various states, repeating those lies and then trying to, refuse to certify on the basis of some alleged fraud. Well, these people are not permitted by law to refuse certification for that reason, or really for any reason. They are compelled by law to certify the election. And all that certification is once the votes are tabulated, they certify that this is the final count of the vote. That's really all it means. They don't get to withhold certification. Okay, they can't just say, well, I think there was fraud, so I'm not certifying. They don't have that discretion under the law. Okay? In fact, we just had a case decided in Georgia in the last couple weeks on exactly this point, whether these elections officials in Georgia, and this would be the same in any other state, whether they had the authority to refuse certification on the basis of fraud, of some alleged fraud. And the judge made very clear that they have no such authority under law. Their certification of the election is compelled by law. They shall certify once the votes are counted. They don't get to refuse certification for whatever reason. And the judge went on to say, if they believe that there is fraud, if they have evidence of fraud, then they can refer that to the appropriate investigating law enforcement authority or prosecutorial office, whether it's a district attorney or the attorney general or whatever it is in whatever given state. But you don't just get to say, well, I think there was fraud. Even if they think they have proof of fraud, they don't get to say, I have proof of fraud, so I'm not certifying. No, you don't get to do that. These elections officials are not law enforcement. They're not adjudicatory bodies. They don't get to make that decision, right? They can't. All they can do is count the votes and certify the count. That's all they can do. If they think there's fraud, they have to refer it to the appropriate agency. That's it. That's all the authority they have to do. And in fact, if they refuse, depending upon the state, they could be arrested for refusal to certify. And they could certainly be removed from office. The court can order certification. It's just, they're not going to be able to just refuse to certify. Doesn't happen that way. And you can't just throw out the entire vote of a state or a county, even if there is fraud. If there is some sort of fraud, then you have to prove individual acts of fraud in court. And then you can throw out those individual votes that were the result of fraud. You don't just get to say, oh, there was some fraud over here, so we get to throw out the whole state's election. You don't get to, voting in this country, this is democracy, right? So voting is a fundamental right in this country. You don't get to disenfranchise people because some other people might have committed fraud. That's not the way it works. You think there's fraud, prove it, and then deal with those acts of fraud. You don't invalidate an entire election. You don't get to refuse to certify an election because you find fraud. And certainly you don't get to even throw out any votes just on the allegation of fraud. There has to be a factual determination and a legal determination in a court of law. Not by these stupid elections officials, these Trump cultists who just say they're going to refuse to certify. All they're going to end up doing is getting themselves thrown in jail. If they want that, I'm happy to see them in jail, but they're not going to be successful in refusing to certify the election. So really, that's not something to be too concerned about. Okay, so that's one thing with respect to the states. The other thing to be concerned about is, lawsuits being filed after the election under state law. Now, that's something to be concerned about, but it's not really anything we can talk about right now. We'd have to wait to see what the facts are, the legal theories proposed, what's the basis of the lawsuit. And we can get into the specifics if and when those lawsuits come. But right now, we just need to be on guard for those lawsuits. And, of course, the Kamala Harris team is anticipating lawsuits. These lawyers are ready to go, so nothing to be too concerned about there. Now let's move on to Congress, because I know a lot of people are concerned about Trump trying to steal this election in Congress. I mean, last time he tried to steal it in Congress, and now he's got this deal with Mike Johnson, presumably to try to steal it in Congress again. So it's obviously something we need to be concerned about. But we need to understand what exactly Congress's role in the certification process is, because I think a lot of people misunderstand this. And their role comes from two places. Number one, the Constitution, the 12th Amendment, and then by statute, which have been passed by Congress. First in the Electoral Count Act, and then in the Electoral Count Reform Act, which was passed in 2022. Now, if to the extent that a statute is in conflict with the Constitution, the statute is unconstitutional, right, and has no effect. And in my opinion, there are parts of the Electoral Count Act, as reformed in 2022, which are clearly unconstitutional, which I will explain. But let's understand the system that the framers designed. First of all, the states, we have a system in which the states elect the president through the Electoral College. Now think of the Electoral College, whatever you want, but that is the system that we have right now. And in that system, the states elect the president. They do so by choosing electors. And they get to decide however they want to choose the electors. Okay, and the states have chosen, they've all chosen to pick their electors by vote of the people. Most of the states have chosen a winner-take-all system, just by popular vote. Whoever has the most votes wins all that state's electoral votes. And the electoral votes are chosen are determined by the state's representation in Congress. The 2 senators plus their representatives gives you the number of electoral votes. And that can change depending upon population. And so each state chooses to select their electors by vote of the people. Maine and Nebraska don't do it by winner take all, but they still do it by vote of the people. Now the states don't have to do it that way. They can choose their electors any way they want. They could let the legislature choose the elector. They can let the governor select the electors. They could do it by lottery if they wanted to. They could let Bob the Butcher choose the electors. I mean, they could do it however they want, but they've chosen to do it by votes of the people. Okay, so the states choose their electors. Now, the framers of they needed a place where all these electors could be sent and be counted, and the winner of the election announced. And they decided to do that in Congress, in a joint session of Congress. So that's where Congress gets involved. The states choose their electors, then send them by a sealed certificate, to the Congress of the United States, where the vice president receives them and opens them. They count the votes and they announce who wins. Only in the event that no one gets a majority of the votes does Congress have any substantive role in choosing the president. And in that case, it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives, by state delegation, each state delegation getting 1 vote, chooses the president of the United States. But only if there's no majority vote. Okay, so this all comes from the 12th Amendment, which I want to read right now. Let me put it up on screen for you. Okay, so this is the 12th Amendment. Now, I'm going to explain why I think this is unconstitutional, at least parts of the Electoral Count Act, which I will explain. But I want you to notice, nowhere in the 12th Amendment does it say that Congress gets to certify the election. It's not up to them. All they get to do is count the votes and announce the winner. That is Congress's role. This idea that Congress gets to certify or not certify and throw out votes and they get to decide, that comes from statute. And to that extent, I believe that that statute is unconstitutional, which I'll explain. But let's begin with the 12th Amendment. All right? And again, look for the word here, certification. You won't find it anywhere. Look for the Constitution giving members of Congress the ability to object to votes or throw votes out. You won't find it anywhere because the Constitution never gave Congress any such authority. You know who gave Congress that authority? Congress gave Congress that authority. We'll get to that in a second. Let's begin with the 12th Amendment. Here's what it says. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president. And they shall make distinct lists of all persons voted for as president, and of all persons voted for as vice president, and of the number of votes for each, which lists they shall sign and certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President. So let me pause there. So here they're just saying what I said. The states choose, they select their electors, they transmit their electors to Congress. Okay, so that's where we are. They're directed to the President of the Senate, which is the Vice President of the United States. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. Let me pause right there. Do you see that? The President of the Senate, i.e. the Vice President, shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. That is the Vice President's entire role in the presidential election, in the quote-unquote certification of the election. That line right there is where Donald Trump and his co-conspirators came up with this idea that the Vice President can throw out electoral votes. Right there. Does that sound to you like he has the constitutional authority to throw out electoral votes? Of course not. The only authority the vice president has is to open the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. He doesn't even have the specific authority to count the votes. It just says the votes shall then be counted. The Senate can determine how it votes, how it counts the votes, who gets to count the votes. All the vice president specifically has the authority to do is open the certificates. That's it. Nowhere does he have authority to challenge any of the votes, to throw out any of the votes. You know, J.D. Vance is out there saying, oh, I would have sent it back to the states. Do you see that the vice president has authority to send it back to the states? Of course not. It's absurd. Okay, continuing. The president open all certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be the president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. And if no person having such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representatives from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of members or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. And if the House of Representatives shall not choose a president, whenever the right of choice shall devolve upon them, before the 4th day of March next following, then the vice president shall act as president. And in the case of the death or other constitutional disability of the president, the person having the greatest number of votes as vice president, shall be vice president. If such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if no person have a majority, then from the 2 highest numbers of the list, the Senate shall choose the vice president. A quorum for the purpose shall consist of 2/3 of the whole number of senators, and a majority of the whole number shall be necessary to a choice. But no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. Okay, that's it. That's the whole thing. That's Congress's role in the election of president as laid out by the Constitution. Do you see anywhere in there the word certify or object or throw out or anything along those lines? No. The role of Congress in the election of president, as contemplated and laid out by the Constitution, is simply to receive the electoral votes from the states, to count them and announce the winner. That's it. That's their entire role. Unless no candidate gets a majority, then the House of Representatives gets to choose the president. That's it. That's their only authority. So why are we so worried about Trump trying to steal the election? Congress can't do anything but announce, count the votes and announce the winner. Well, we're worried about it because of the power that Congress gave to itself in the Electoral Count Act, which is, in my opinion, and I am a constitutional law attorney, I've been studying this stuff my entire life, is flatly unconstitutional. The reason it's still on the books is because it's never been challenged in court. And courts just don't review statutes on their own. They have to have a case brought to them. Article 3 empowers the federal courts only to decide cases and controversies, which means they need a case brought to them. They can't just review statutes and declare them unconstitutional. And a case has never been brought to them. So therefore, this thing is on the books. But the reason it's unconstitutional is because Congress gives itself power over the presidential election that the Constitution does not give to it. And it is a fundamental principle of constitutional law that no branch of government can give to itself power that the Constitution does not give to it. So Congress cannot write a law empowering itself over the president, or over the election of president. Okay, so where they give themselves the authority to object to votes, because that's what we're worried about here. The Electoral Count Act gave Congress the power to object to electoral votes, to object to the votes of the states. And in the Electoral Count Act itself, the original Electoral Count Act, said that all it required was 1 senator and 1 member of the House to object. At which point, Each body would then have to debate it, and then they could vote to throw out electoral votes, ostensibly, right? So that's where that comes from, and that's what we're worried about. We're worried about Congress objecting to electoral votes if Kamala Harris wins. Well, that part of the Electoral Count Act is flatly unconstitutional because the Congress gave itself authority to elect electoral votes. It gave itself authority over the presidential election that the Constitution does not give to it. It's clearly unconstitutional, but it's on the books because, as I said, it's never been challenged. So we have to deal with it. If it ends up going to court, I believe that it will be determined to be unconstitutional for the reason I explained to you. But given this Supreme Court, I don't make any predictions about this ridiculous Supreme Court anymore, although I would be shocked if they upheld this ridiculous statute. Seriously. I mean, it's that basic and that fundamental. But then again, this court is that corrupt. But so anyways, that's what we're worried about. Now, the Electoral Count Reform Act in 2022 sought to make it harder for Congress to object and to reject electoral votes. So they raised the threshold from just one senator and one member of the House to it now requires 1/5 of the senators and 1/5 of the House to object, and then it would open it up to debate. But even if that happens, because look, 1/5 is 1/5 of the House of Representatives, controlled by Trump cultists? Yeah. More than 20% of the House of Representatives is comprised of Trump cultists. Senate, probably the same thing. So it's something to worry about, right? Yes. But that alone is not enough. In order to refuse certification or reject any of these votes, each body would have to vote. It would take a majority vote of the House and of the Senate. And in the Senate, you'd presumably have to overcome the filibuster. So it's not very likely to happen. And if this whole thing happened, I would imagine that Kamala Harris's lawyers would run to court, and I would hope that they would challenge the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act, at least with respect to this idea that Congress even gets to challenge or object to electoral votes at all, because they very clearly, under the Constitution, do not. Again, Congress cannot vote to give itself power over the the vote for president that the Constitution does not give to it. Congress doesn't get to select the president unless there's no majority vote in the Electoral College, and then it goes to the House. So this is flatly unconstitutional. Hopefully we don't have to get to court to challenge the constitutionality of it. I don't think we will. And if we did get to court, I think it would be, I really do. Even this horribly corrupted Supreme Court, I think, would throw out the Electoral Count Act, at least in that respect. Not in all respects. There's other parts of the Electoral Count Act which are perfectly fine. Parts of the Electoral Count Act which deal with the procedures for doing this or that, that's fine. They can come up with their own procedures for implementing their constitutional authority. What they can't do is give themselves more authority than the Constitution gives to Congress over the presidential election. So anyway, okay, so we have that. Now let's deal with the statute itself. Because as I say, it's still on the books, and if it's challenged and it gets thrown out, great. I think it would get thrown out, at least parts of it. But it's still on the books, so unless and until it's found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, we have to deal with it, right? And so the first thing it does is it raises the threshold from one senator, one representative to 1/5 of the House and 1/5 of the Senate. So that was very important. So it did that. What else does it do? It limits the grounds upon which that 1/5 of the House and 1/5 of the Senate can challenge electoral votes. You can't just challenge it for any reason. You can't just say, oh, we think there was fraud in the state. That's not for Congress to determine. So it limits the grounds for objections to two. First is that the electors of a state were not lawfully certified, or that an elector's vote was not regularly given. Now, we don't need to get into the weeds of this. It's just very unlikely for them to meet either of those two grounds. And by the way, those grounds can be challenged in court also. The law also provides for expedited review in the courts. So, if Kamala Harris went to court to challenge what was going on in the Congress, we don't have to wait for months and months and months for the courts to get involved. They are required to take this case on an expedited basis. Okay, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. I hope this wasn't too confusing. I could just tell while I'm doing this, this is probably sounding confusing. I didn't mean it to be, but this just the nature of this is another reason why I've kind of been putting this off, because I don't know exactly how to lay it out in a really manageable way. So, but I hope some of you stuck through this and understood it. The point of the matter is, Electoral Count Act, in my opinion, is unconstitutional, but it's on the books, so we have to deal with it. But even as it stands, very difficult for Donald Trump to prevail in Congress. Also, I don't want to. It's already been long enough. I don't need to go any further. Let's just say this. It's not going to be easy in the states because people in the states with authority over the election process have no authority to just refuse to certify. So they can't do that. Don't worry about that. And in the Congress, very difficult to prevail with the law as it has been reformed in 2022. It's much more difficult for Trump to be able to challenge certification in Congress. And as a last ditch effort, if Donald Trump is somehow successful in doing that, I believe that part of the Electoral Count Act is clearly unconstitutional and would be thrown out even in this corrupted Supreme Court. But finally, keep this in mind. None of this matters in Congress if Democrats win back control of the House of Representatives. Whatever deal Donald Trump has with Mike Johnson, they won't be able to implement because Mike Johnson won't be Speaker of the House if Democrats win back control of Congress tomorrow. Because the new Congress is sworn in on January 3rd, and certification of the presidential election takes place on January 6th. So if we win tomorrow and we take back control of the House, which looks likely, then it will be a Democrat-controlled Congress who will be overseeing this process. It will be Hakeem Jeffries, most likely, as Speaker of the House on January 6th. So none of this is all just theoretical at that point because this isn't going to happen. So why don't we just do this? How's this for a deal? How about we just get out and win this freaking election? How about we win back control of not just the House, but both houses of Congress? And why don't we win this presidential election? Why don't we defeat Donald Trump so thoroughly that it's not even close enough for him to really contest in any meaningful way? Because that's the thing. If it's not close, there's really nothing he can do. He can only even try to cheat if this election is close. So how about we just make it so it's not close? Let's just go out and beat his orange ass in a landslide. How about that? And let's make Hakeem Jeffries the next Speaker of the House. How about that? Then we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. So that's what I think that's the best course of action. Anyways, thank you so much for sticking with me through this video. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Turn on notifications. Follow the Romano Report on Facebook and keep it here because I'm probably going to be doing a lot more videos in the next few days. So that's it. Get out and vote if you haven't done so already and take as many people with you as you can to vote for Kamala Harris. Let's do this thing. Thanks for watching.